Hello and welcome once again to our living room. I'm sitting here with my wife, your therapist, and today we're going to be talking about grief.
Yep.
My name is Price, and I married your therapist.
I'm Ash, and I'm your therapist. Please keep in mind that even though this is a podcast about mental health and therapy, it's not the same thing as or a replacement for therapy.
Ash, before we dive into that, I want to tell you congratulations.
Tell me congratulations.
Yes, the
Okay.
podcast recently hit 10,000 downloads.
Woo! That was genuinely so cool.
Isn't that exciting?
It is so exciting.
10,000 individual downloads of the podcast over our, I think, 8 months now that we've been doing it.
Yeah, that's so cool.
What a huge milestone. Congratulations.
Yes, congrats to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thrilled and kind of overwhelmed to see that. I don't really know what that means. I mean, nobody's paying us anything yet, so
Yeah.
I'll get excited when I get like $10,000 from the podcast.
$10,000 would be fun.
Yeah, but anyways, to those of you who are sticking with us and listening, thank you so much. It means so much to us.
Yeah.
And hitting 10,000 downloads, we couldn't have done it without y'all. So
Yep.
please, thank you so much. Please understand how much that means to us. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please tell your friends. Tell your family. Tell your Dungeons and Dragons group. Tell your Alcohol Anonymous group. Dig up Grandma. Tell her about it. We're grateful, and we're spreading through word of mouth. So if this is helping you or means anything to you in any way, please feel free to, or please tell the people that you know that might be interested. Leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you can leave a review. That actually helps us get the word out.
Yeah.
Connect with us on social media, Instagram, TikTok, not Facebook. Fuck Facebook.
I don't think
We're not
we
on
have a
Facebook.
Facebook.
Are we on LinkedIn? We're not. Fuck LinkedIn too.
We're not on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And then also, if you ever want us to talk about a specific topic, or if you have a question, or in any way just want to reach out to us, feel free to email imarriedyourtherapist@gmail.com. And we really love hearing from our fans. We really love hearing from our listeners. It means so much to you guys, to us, when you guys do that. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's been incredible, and we're definitely hearing people say that like it's meant something to them, and they've known of like a friend in need and sent it to them, and that's very cool. I like that a lot.
So in the words of Charlie Brown, good grief.
Good grief.
We were discussing topics for the podcast, and you said you wanted to talk about grief.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about grief for a while. Interestingly, like I've been thinking about it for a while, as I tend to do, where I'm just like thinking and never say anything out loud. And then I very autistic of me. And then we had been talking about it, and then just in these last couple of weeks I've had a lot of clients talking about grief as well. So I think it's a good time to get to do that.
It's been on your mind.
I've been processing some grief recently, which we can you are pulling up my microphone, which
Sorry.
we can talk about. But yeah, I just think that would be good. I think, well, here's why I want to talk about it. Everybody deals with grief.
Yeah.
We tend to think about grief as something, and we'll definitely talk about this, but we tend to think about grief as something that's just like when a loved one dies. That's grieving.
For me, it's somebody has passed away, and we are in a stage of grief that is like we can illustrate very clearly through like wearing black clothes to a our dog's being cute. I'm sorry. Wearing black clothes to a funeral, like we are grieving, like that's
Right.
a formal thing or somewhat formal thing.
And it's a somewhat timed thing as well. It's
Yeah.
like just applies to those situations, and it lasts for a certain amount
Or
of
on the
time.
other hand, like when the Lord of the Rings of Power show came out, I went through a period of grieving for just how bad that show is.
Yeah, that's the alternative side of grief, which is that it can be about a lot of things.
And if y'all are into Lord of the Rings, if you share that interest of mine, I have a lot to say, so the other half of this podcast will be about my grieving of Rings of Power.
No, we're not going to spend half the podcast on that, but if you really want to talk to Price about Lord of the Rings, please email imarriedyourtherapist@gmail.com. He would love to talk to you about it.
I know more than you do.
Oh my God. Not to this audience.
That's true. That's fair. Okay. I'm excited to learn about this because grief is one of the topics that you and I have not discussed in at great length. So I think I'm in to learn as much as just anybody
Yeah.
listening this time around. And I'm interested to hear more about like how we're impacted by grief, but we don't call it grief because nobody died. You
Right.
know, but we grieve things all the time. So
Yeah.
yeah, take us away. What do you want to share with us today?
So I think the best place to start is with traditional grief and some things that you might know, some things that you might not know about it, kind of our traditional view of grief. And then we can talk more about how grieving applies to everybody. I think grieving is like one of the main functions of the work of therapy is identifying spots of grief in our life and being able to name that and work through it.
What do you what does work through it mean exactly?
Um,
Because that's what therapy's doing for us. We're helping us work through grief. You know, what
right.
is I'm sure that means different things to different people. But what does that mean to you?
Um, When I say, well, it's what I want to do today. When I say work through grief, I think it's adjusting our idea of what the timeline for grief is supposed to be. That a lot of times we don't even allow ourselves to feel grief for things because it happened a long time ago and it's fine. It's fine. We've like moved on. It's not a big deal. So some of that is adjusting the timeline of what we allow ourselves to consider grief and identifying other things that we're grieving that aren't the loss of a loved one, that aren't like death specifically. And then the work of grief is just allowing yourself to feel that. I have a really beautiful quote I wanted to share that I think will fit
Yeah,
here.
yeah. Let's do it.
So, David Kessler is a therapist who owns like grief.com. He's amazing. He is the person. If you're talking
Okay.
about grief, you're talking about David Kessler because he's doing a lot of this work. And he's like this very lovely, soft, gentle, kind man. He's so easy to listen to. But he says on his website, we think we want to avoid grief, but it's really the pain of the loss that we want to avoid. Grief is the healing process that ultimately brings us comfort in our pain. So, a lot of what I'll hear is people going, oh, I don't want to be sad about that. Like, I don't want to spend my
Right.
time having to
Right.
be sad about this. But it's very true that like we're saying we want to avoid grief, but grief is the good bit. Grief is the bit that's moving us closer to healing. We're trying to avoid all the feelings that come with grief, all of the stuff, but that stuff is there. That stuff is there
You are
anyway.
suffering that either way.
If you're not openly getting to acknowledge that, it's eating you away somewhere. So I think grief is really important for everybody to understand and talk about.
I think that's really interesting that uh, grief is good.
Yeah.
Good grief.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think grief is good.
And I'm no anthropologist, but I think almost every culture has a like one of the ways that we are the grounding tenets of a culture is that we mourn and bury our dead.
Yes.
Right? That's something
So,
that like all almost all humans have in common is that we have rituals around our dead and
yes.
grieving our dead.
Yeah, we have, I mean, I think at like the bare minimum, we have funerals. And then I think so many other cultures have much more beautiful celebrations of grief. Well, okay. The funerals that I went to were all like almost all hyper religious. And so that was the context for that. I've also now been to other sorts of funerals, but yeah, and I think in a lot of cultures there's also like a celebration that comes with it that's really beautiful. There's a remembrance that comes with it. And the most important thing is that our grief must be observed. Our grief must have a witness. We're not built to grieve on our own. We're meant to grieve with other people.
How do you I've heard you say that before. How do you know that that's true? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, here's the biggest, like most obvious example of it. Folks that lost a loved one during COVID and didn't get to have a funeral, a lot of those people are very stuck in their grief. And I've talked to a lot of clients who lost somebody during COVID and nobody was getting together for funerals, so everybody grieved on their own. And they never moved past it because we're meant to be able to come together and to remember together. And I think in the grief that you and I have experienced, some of the most important parts of those memories to me are the times where we're all like sitting in the living room together, going over pictures and remembering together. I think it's true that probably all of our emotions need a witness. I think all of us needs to be observed and witnessed at some point.
Sure.
But specifically with grief, I think that your grieving process gets halted when it's something that you're not able to do in the company of
I've
others.
just made a decision right
Okay.
here, right now. My funeral should be remote. You can log into my funeral. You don't need to leave your house. I wouldn't do that to you. It's going to be a 45-minute Zoom call. Cameras optional.
But what I so you just want people to like be stuck on your grief forever? Is
No,
that
no,
what
no,
you're
no. We'll
saying?
process it, but like from the privacy of our own homes. I would never ask you to put on pants and leave your house. That's fucking horrific.
And as kind as I think that is, as somebody who hates to leave the house and put on pants, I think that people wouldn't be able to get past it
Yeah, they need to.
because
We
that's
we
what
need to be
happened.
together. Yeah.
So let's talk kind of about just specific, like grieving the loss of a loved one. I think there are a couple of things people should know.
Okay. Yeah.
I do think that it needs to be observed. It's important that we like have funerals and stuff. I've recently heard about some families, I guess over the course of my life as well, but families where somebody dies under difficult circumstances. They die by suicide, they die from an overdose, they die from something that like we already are so uncomfortable with death, but we feel particularly uncomfortable treading, and
You just
families
said
are
we're so uncomfortable with death. Fuck yeah, I'm uncomfortable with death. I'm dead. I'm gone forever, and that does make me uncomfortable, man.
That's true, but
It
it's
fucks me up. You know, every time I get
I
too
know.
high, I'm like, bro, I'm gonna die someday, and I like grapple with that like hard.
I think it's really unfortunate, and I think that that feeling is like true. It's something that I relate to, but I think that feeling is the result of you and I being a part of a culture that can't talk about death. Like, we don't have a ceremony around like going out and remembering our loved ones and knowing that like even when we go we're included in the lives of the people that we care about, and that can be something like we all die, we all have to die.
Yeah,
And then that can be something that like we can feel
peace about.
some peace around.
Right.
But anyway, I've heard about families not like having a funeral when somebody dies of like suicide or overdose or
Because they're like
something, not wanting
ashamed.
to mention it.
Wow.
And that, I mean, to me is horrifying. But also, we like there's something important we miss there, even when it's tough, even when it's somebody that like, oh, that's a hard thing to talk about. We need that, and like that person's life mattered. That was a whole human life, and like I think that those things are really important. I think it's sad the way that again as a culture we like don't want to talk about death.
Yeah, if you catch me in the most humiliating scenario and upon which I have died, and I thought of all sorts of funny things I could say, and none of them were like remotely appropriate on any level. But yeah, you better still have that Zoom call.
It's still okay. Okay. All right. So talking just about like grief, that is the grief that we tend to all talk about or like know about. That's the grief when somebody that we love dies. There are a couple of things that I think are important. One, I think it's important that we grieve together with other people. Not everybody's family are the best folks to go grieve with, so I can understand there are a lot of reasons not to be able to make it to a funeral, a lot of reasons not to want to be around the other people who are grieving, but just know that like you still need to go to your community and be around those people. You need to reach out to your friends and tell them that you're sad. A couple of other things that people might not know. David Kessler defines, I think this is based on like a research study, but this is where I'm hearing it. Early grief. How long do you think early grief lasts?
Early grief is like the grief you feel immediately.
Yeah, early grief is like this is visceral early days. It's impacting your life deeply.
Weeks, if not months.
2 years.
Really? Mm-hmm. Oh wow.
So hopefully there are parts of your life that are returning within 2 years. That's not to say that like you should expect that for the first 2 years nothing happens. But I think about your mom and grieving your grandfather, and that the first round of birthdays and holidays without that person, and then almost worse, the second round of birthdays and holidays without that person. And just like hitting different times of year that were important to you or that you have a memory around, seeing a picture come up on your phone, whatever it is. Early grief is defined as lasting for 2 years. It is a long time that you might be feeling very sad.
What defines like early grief? Because if it's going on for 2 years, like what's evolving between 2 years and then grief after those 2 years? What is the difference?
Um, so I think that there's a really good analogy for this. If you had the way that like grief transitions over time. If you picture a box, like just picture a literal square, and think about a button on one side of that square, and that button is like the grief button. That's the full intensity of what grieving feels like. And there's a ball in that box. And early on, the ball takes up the whole entire box, and it's touching the grief button all of the time. And as time goes on, the ball shrinks. The button's still there though, so that ball's bouncing around in the box, and a
Oh,
holiday
because you're on
comes up.
steroids.
Wait, what?
The ball shrinks.
Oh,
That's what you because of like PED
right,
abuse.
right. Yeah,
Right.
that's why.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Please continue. I'm with you now.
Okay, so over time, the ball shrinks and it's bouncing around in this box. But on like it's a holiday or it's a memory or whatever, and it hits that button, their song comes on. And it hits that button, it's the full strength of grief coming through in that moment. Maybe it's still like full tears and all of those things. But over time it's hitting that button less often. And it doesn't mean that there's not some feeling or awareness, but it's not that like constant bringing on our full waves of grief at
So what you're
once.
saying is like that when that button gets pressed, it's the same level of intensity of
Mm-hmm.
feeling. It's just being pressed less often. So it's
Yeah.
not that you like miss this person less. They're
Yeah.
just not as prevalent to you. Probably because you're getting used to life without them.
Yeah, well, I think the habit is an especially hard part of grieving somebody. The habit of like being able to reach out and regularly talk to them, to know that you can like ask their advice and connect with them,
Right.
and not no longer having that opportunity, I think is a very difficult part
I
of grief.
recently had a button get pushed.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is I'm fortunate to have not have lost too many people in my
Mm-hmm.
life, but my grandfather, he passed 8 years ago, 9 years ago now. I don't really.
2015.
Yeah. And so I just got a new phone,
Mm-hmm.
switching phones over, heard a voicemail
Yeah.
come up, and I
Yeah.
was like full button push, like
Yes.
I was back, I was like there again, like
Exactly
hurting,
that.
crying,
Yeah.
missing him. Don't
Yes.
really experience. I don't experience that very often these
Yeah,
days.
we frequently get to talk about him without that being like a whole moment of grief. Like that button doesn't get pushed with every remembrance.
Right.
There's a lot of
Which
like,
was the case before.
which
Like
was the
every
case
time
before.
yeah.
Because again, this ball's like, I know it's a silly analogy, but it's especially helpful, I think, to imagine like this ball and it's just pressed up against all the walls of this box and is just constantly pressing that button.
Yeah.
And the grief is so intense all of the time. Every remembrance, everything, it feels like that all the time. But yeah, then most of the time we're remembering and this ball's bouncing around in the box and it's fine. We're like happily remembering and there's dearness to that memory, but it doesn't bring on that full wave of grief. But occasionally it still hits that grief button, and that's a very intense, overwhelming feeling. I still sometimes have moments like that with your grandfather too.
Oh well.
Yeah.
You never even met him, so
I did too.
I'm kidding.
Aw.
um. Okay.
So, sorry, what was your question?
No, so I just want to understand like where the proverbial ball is shrinking. What does long-term grief look like then? Because you have like
Well,
early grief, that means
yeah,
that there's like late grief, right? So
yeah.
is it just a continually shrinking? Because I remember like my grandparents, my great grandmother, who was in a good state of mind, and I knew for many years. She didn't seem to actively grieve like her husband who had passed decades prior, and she
Mhm.
didn't seem to actively grieve like the loss of her parents who had died hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago. Um, so it just like she's in her 80s and 90s during this period. So it just seemed like maybe it's not that she misses. It's not that she doesn't miss these people, but it just seemed like her life had looked so different now that
Yeah.
she wasn't being reminded of them a lot. I don't know. Like,
Well, I think I've experienced watching an older person remember their parents and start crying again. Like, have you
oh,
seen that
really?
happen? Well, think about like Papa, think about your grandfather and remembering his brother who had died when they were both young, and how most of his life he's fine. He's going on, he remembers that he had a brother, but it's not actively
And
pressing
talking
grief
about
then.
him and sharing about
Yeah.
him and stuff.
But occasionally Papa would get very sad about the death of his brother. And I've encountered that in older folks as well, where most of the time it's like, yeah, my husband and I did this, and my parents were like this, and we did these things, and occasionally that grief still hits. But it's
The button gets
the
pushed.
button gets
Yeah.
pushed, but it's still, but it's that you have more ability to just go about the daily activities of living and to remember them with joy instead of always the sadness of that process that we go through.
Of the loss.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Because at first, the loss takes up every bit of our memories of them. That's something else. I was talking to a friend whose mom died, and she was saying, oh God, I lost my train of thought.
You were talking about a friend who lost their mom.
Right.
Talking with a friend,
Yeah.
and she was overwhelmed with the sense of loss. I'm guessing.
Yeah, she said you worry at first that those old memories aren't going to come back. She's like, when you think of that person, you think of all the sad, hard stuff at the end.
Yeah.
And she's like, you worry that that stuff isn't going to come back.
I'm just gonna remember you when you were sick.
Right. I'm
Right.
just going to, and a lot of people will avoid those moments because of that. They don't want to see their loved one in the hospital. They don't want to be a part of those final moments because they're like, I don't want this to color my picture of them. I want to remember the good stuff. And that's fair. That's a normal thing that we do. But the truth is, and what she was sharing is that, like, but then that other stuff comes back. You stop being in those early days of grief where you remember that in stuff the most. And you start to remember them as a whole person. And now you
Yeah.
go back and see this whole picture of their life and who they were and how they grew. And that in stuff is just, that was a moment. That was a little bit of the whole life that we shared together.
I feel a deep-seated sense of pain and hurt and guilt over exactly what you just said,
Yeah.
of not wanting to be with somebody when they're sick and dying,
Yeah.
because I wasn't there and I chose not to be there. And it wasn't even a conscious choice. It was like, okay, I'm going to go home and get some rest.
Yeah.
And my grandfather's dying and asked me not to leave.
Mm-hmm.
He can barely speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I like had to get the fuck out of there.
Yeah.
And he passed that night.
Yeah.
And that I'll always like have to live with that, you know. But yeah, I think that I was so uncomfortable. I didn't want to be there.
Sure, Connie. But you had a lifetime of memories with that person, and that person had a lifetime of memories with you. And that was like a moment in your life. And so for everybody who's had a moment like that, that's okay. Like that doesn't become the whole relationship. But at first, and especially in our earlier grief, like that's the bit that we remember, of course. And that's a lot to do with the stages of grief, which I think is a good thing to get to talk about as well.
Yeah.
The stages of grief, have you heard of that? The
Yeah.
5 stages of grief?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a robot chicken, which is a show on Adult Swim, and it's a giraffe that's been caught in quicksand.
Okay.
And he goes through the 5
He goes through the
stages
stages?
of grief
Nice.
while he's slowly sinking.
Okay.
And it's like elongated by or it's the giraffe's neck.
Right,
and so
right,
it's just
it's
going
going
on
all
and
the way
on
down.
and on. And it goes through like the stage of like anger and
Yeah.
I forget all the
Yeah.
or the order or whatever, but my God, that was funny. I think that was like high school or middle school for me. That always will be like an iconic.
That's hilarious.
Skit.
Okay, that's great. that example because the stages of grief we often talk about as part of grief, but the stages of grief were developed to describe somebody who was working with people given terminal diagnoses. The
Okay.
stages of grief is something that describes what people who know that they are dying go
Oh,
through.
okay. Okay.
It,
Because we hear about it universally applied to
yeah.
anybody grieving in any circumstance, but you're
Yes,
telling me
exactly.
it's like I am dying. You've told me I am dying. Here
Right.
are the stages of my.
Yes,
Okay.
it was developed by and described by somebody who was working with people receiving end of life care because they had been given a terminal diagnosis.
Oh wow. Okay.
And so it's describing the stages that they would go
I
through.
hate to sound like 14 and this is deep, but aren't we all given terminal diagnosis from the day we're born? What did Ben Franklin say? Death and taxes.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
He said death and taxes. It didn't have like that. Those are the only two guarantees in life is death and taxes. That. Of course, the government guy said death and
death
taxes.
and
He's like,
taxes.
motherfucker, you gonna be paying taxes. You're
Yeah,
gonna be
yeah. You
born
better
here. You're gonna
expect
pay
this.
taxes.
I really want people to associate the same level of knowing they have to face their death as knowing they have to face those. It's coming for you one way or the other. Get on board. Okay, so those stages were created to describe what was happening with these people dealing with a terminal
Yeah.
diagnosis.
Okay.
Um,
Legit didn't know that. That's
yeah,
that's cool.
most people don't, and um, I think that that's important for a lot of reasons. It's described. We tend to think about them as like you move through each one in order, and this is exactly what happens. So it actually does turn out that it's a pretty good descriptor for us in our own grief as well. Not only do we all have to face like death and taxes, but also it's a pretty good descriptor for the stages that we go through. That said, the stages don't happen directly in order. They're not prescriptive, so it's not what you should go through. It's descriptive because it's describing what we do tend to go through. If you never heard about the stages of grief, you would still go through the same things, in other words. So it's not telling you
Yeah.
what you need to do to move through. It's just
This is what
identifying what
humans
happens. This
normally
is what
do
humans do.
when they're experiencing grief.
So the 5 stages of grief, the first is denial. And that makes a lot of sense within the context specifically of somebody dealing with a terminal diagnosis
Great swimming.
in denial.
Yeah.
You are messing with my autistic brain. I'm like very much in grief right now. Like, ooh, we are up in this moment, and your references are making it very challenging for me.
Sorry.
It's allowed.
Okay.
It's allowed. That's why you're here.
So
We have
in
to bring
denial.
some levity. In denial.
Okay.
Denial makes more sense as a stage when somebody's receiving a terminal diagnosis because there does tend to be the stage that they go through of like, I don't feel like I'm dying. I'm not
Yeah.
dying.
Yeah, I'm fine.
And they go about their life. They're like, no, no, no. I'm going to keep going to my job. I'm going to keep going to the grocery store and just doing what I normally do. And that's a normal stage. For us, denial doesn't necessarily look like it's less about, I don't believe my loved one has died or I don't believe this thing has happened. Maybe it is. Sometimes it is. But more often it's, I can't believe they're not going to walk through the door again. Like that doesn't make sense. Every time the door opens, I think that they might come through it. Every time I get a phone call, I think that it might be them. That's kind of a better description of denial when we're talking about our own grief, not the grief of knowing that you're about to die. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those are the stages. And so again, it's not prescriptive. It's not what you have to do. It's just the things that you're likely to encounter. And you don't have to encounter them in order, and you probably move back and forth through them. There are probably moments of still feeling that sense of like, it still feels like they're going to walk through the door any moment. They're so much alive to me.
Yeah.
And you might go through periods of depression and acceptance and then encountering a new wave of grief and feeling like you're right back in it. And that's all okay and normal. But Yeah, the
So
stages
it's
aren't.
not like stage 1, you've got 30 days,
Right.
and then after those 30
Exactly.
days, everyone moves on to stage 2, because as you know, we're
Exactly.
all exactly the same, and we all process things the same.
Exactly. It really tends to shift for different people, and there might be stages that some people never hit. They never go through that bit. The other thing that can happen, specifically with the death of a loved one, is that you can go through anticipatory grief of knowing that that person's going to die, and going through anticipatory grief doesn't mean that you won't then encounter grief on the other side. It's a different sort of grief. But I think some people are like, they feel guilty then for grieving again, or broken for grieving again. They're like, I already did this. I already went through these stages. And like, no, it's just complicated. And again, we're in a different part of that grieving process now.
Hmm. So we're talking about all of this through the lens of losing a loved one,
Right.
somebody passing.
Yep.
But I know a big message that you're wanting to bring to the table today is that people grieve a lot of things.
Yes.
And you were mentioning briefly, because we went to the grocery store today and we were just chatting about grief,
Uh huh.
just
As
shopping,
as
and
folks do.
and you mentioned that a lot of people feel that they feel that they're not able to grieve their whatever it is because nobody died. Grief is
Yes.
reserved for people who die,
Yeah.
and nobody died here, so I'm not grieving. When in
Right.
reality, they are grieving. They're just never able to process through those emotions, so they get
Exactly.
stuck there, and it's like hurting. It's actively working against them, but they
Yeah.
don't even cognitively, um, like they're not cognitively aware of that, right?
Yes.
And that's a big part of what you talk people through in therapy.
Exactly. So, yeah, this has been mostly focused on describing the death of a loved one, and there are going to be a small percentage of the people listening who are right now in those early stages of grief. They're in those first 2 years, or they're coming up to grief, and that's where they're at. But all of us, I think, are grieving something in our lives, and we might not know. And if we're not calling it grief, we might not allow ourselves to feel those feelings. So, one of the biggest things we grieve are the expectations that we had, because we're inherently hopeful people, and even people who are like dealing with depression, I think, are inherently, specifically, very hopeful people because they hoped that things could have been better, and the reality of how things feel is
I
is
think as a
horrible.
generation, we're grieving the fact that the economy that we're growing up in or that we're entering as adults, at least folks my age, is
Yeah.
not the economy our parents operated in.
Yes. Yeah, or I'm grieving the image that I grew up with as a kid of like, this is what I'm going to be able to achieve. This is what I'll do. This is what my late 20s are going to look like. And now, goodbye, late 20s. Like, that's not what got to happen.
Right.
And it's not what's going to happen. Yeah, so our expectations for what our future might hold, um, our expectations for who we wish our parents could have been. And that could be whether our parents are alive or not, or whether we're in contact with them or not. We can have a lot of grief around, I need a parent who saw this in me. I needed a parent who was able to hold space for this in me. And they couldn't do that. And no amount of me hoping that they could changes that. And so grieving expectations is a big one. Grieving a relationship, not just like after a breakup, grieving what we wished it could have been, what we maybe felt very hopeful it could be at the beginning of that relationship. And another thing we tend to grieve there is the time that we feel we lost.
Yeah.
Oh, I spent 2 years in a relationship that didn't work out. I feel like I, lost 2 years of my life. And that's grief. Grieving the childhood that we didn't get to have, that we wish that we could have had, specifically if you didn't get to act much like a kid as a child. Just the expectations of the people we have around us that we stay in relationships with and have good relationships
I'd
with.
even imagine that folks who are persecuted feel quite a bit of grief around that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That, like, it's not easy being trans,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not easy being trans in a world where you're ostracized and hated for being trans, and that must
A,
bring up a lot of grief.
a grief I've heard from a lot of trans clients, and this doesn't apply to everybody, but is like, I really do just wish I could have been born cis. Like, I wish I could have just spent this whole time being the person that I want people to accept me as. And thank you. I wish I could have spent this whole time just like living in this body and living this life and being perceived this way and relating to other people this way. And instead, I've had to spend all of this time like fearfully hiding this or not being accepted by my family or living, my life more authentically but being persecuted for it. I hate that this like takes up so much time and room in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or-
I've heard from a lot of gay folks too. I wish like I could have just been born straight. Life would have been easier for me.
It is easier as a straight guy.
Right.
Y'all
Right.
dealing
Yeah.
with a lot.
No, it is. Yeah. So a lot of different things to grieve, and I think it's really, really important that you feel empowered to call the things you're grieving grief, because grief is like deep and it's raw and it's complicated.
But there's stages. There's a process. You're
There's a
able to work
process.
through it. That's
Yeah.
kind of what I'm getting from this is that you are, when you start grieving something and you call it grief and it's an active thing, you
Yeah.
are working through that. You're not going to just hold that sorrow
Yeah.
forever. You're going to be able to work through it and it's going to have an appropriate and healthy place in your life.
Right. Yeah, again, grief is the process we get to go through to get to the other side of this. It doesn't mean grief is necessarily over in your life. I think there will always be a part of me that grieves like not being very much of a kid when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Just like your loved one, you're going to grieve for the rest of your life. Like there will always be moments of grief for that. But there is a process you can work through. That ball in the box can shrink so that your grief is getting hit less often. And you can welcome the grief when it's hit because you know that it's not forever. Grief is something that comes in waves, and you can experience the full intensity of that grief. Another thing David Kessler says is if you have 1,000 tears to cry, like you can't stop at 999. You'll still have grief left to give. And so if you're like, well, I'm going to allow myself a month to be really sad about this, then I'm just going to move on. Like if you didn't cry all of those tears, if you didn't really get through that, you're going to feel stuck in it. It's going to keep impacting your life in a different way. And that's not to scare somebody. That's to say, like, allow yourself a flexible timeline. Allow yourself to be sad about it for a month, and then maybe you take some time, and then you realize 3 months down the road, you still got a little more sad left in you.
So what do we do with folks who are like, all right, come on, you've been sad for long enough. It's time to, move on.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that a lot of us would love to take the time that we feel like we need.
Yeah.
But aren't surrounded by people who are supportive of that.
Yes. Well, something that people intuitively suspect about their grief, regardless of the type that it is that the people who were there in it with them will be the people most likely to relate to them. And so when those people start telling them to move on, they really feel like, okay, I'm supposed to be done with this. So for instance, if you had a difficult childhood, you might want to grieve with your siblings. And your siblings might not be able to acknowledge their grief, or they might have a different grief. So they might say, no, we're not doing this. We're not going back into the past. We're not doing this thing. And that might push you to feel like, okay, maybe I'm doing something wrong here.
I have done that to my sister, and my sister's done that to me, where we were just not we were never at the same place with
Yep.
like, dealing with or talking
Yeah.
with things that like brought us sorrow
Yeah.
as kids.
Research has shown that the people most likely to get your grief are the people who come down the road while you're grieving. The people that you start to encounter and connect with either over grief or over different things. It tends to be different people in your life who are the ones who help you with the grief, not often, unfortunately, the people who you go through the grief with.
It seems like two things are going to be really important here for people is to be kinder to themselves and more aware of their own grief, but to also be more available to grieve with the people they care about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by that I mean you may not be the one who's hurting or feeling sad, but
Yeah.
you need to be available to your friends who might want to talk through that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. My response to the people being told or feeling like, okay, it's time to move on, those people probably do not understand grief. And even though there are parts of your life you probably do have to get back to, just financially are going to need to get back to,
Yeah.
understanding that like nobody gets to dictate the timeline of your grief, and that if you've still got grief, like you're allowed to have that. And I think it's a really beautiful point that like it's a good reminder that if the people in your life are still grieving something that you feel done with, they're allowed to have that grief as well. They're allowed for it to last longer, and it's allowed for them to hold it in a different way than you do.
But I'm going back to what you were saying, like our grief needs to be witnessed.
Yes.
So be available to witness grief.
That's something we get so uncomfortable with. I hear from people all the time, not just clients, but just from people all the time saying like, I can't be around somebody who cries. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do when somebody's crying. That's not good for me. Other people might be able to do it. It's not good for me. The another thing that I'm remembering from the David Kessler training I went through is like we come from a long line of dead people.
Yeah.
We come from a long line of people who've experienced grief in all of its forms. You, the person who says that you can't be around somebody crying, yes, you can. Yes, you can. Like we come from a long line of people who've been around grief. Most likely, you come from a short line of people who weren't great at grieving. I come from a shorter line of people not great at grieving or being there in each other's grief.
But
We don't
death
really
was a
talk
much
about it.
more regular part of life
Yeah.
for our ancestors than it is now.
Yeah. We all come from long lines of people who knew how to grieve and who knew how to hold each other in our grief. And so it's important to know that, like, when you're around somebody who's grieving, there are a couple of different things you can do. One is to provide very practical support, especially when somebody's in like loss of a loved one sort of grieving, where it's just that like visceral can't do anything sort of grief. That's what our traditions are for. We have traditions around bringing food, checking in, you know that their kids have to be driven to and from school. Offer to help with that. Offer to help with just the day-to-day parts of trying to live their life that are going to be really hard in these very early days of grief.
Right.
Write down the dates that are important of the people in your life. If you're, if somebody you care about just lost a loved one, make sure you know when that loved one's birthday is, when their anniversary was, when that death date is, and make sure that you continue to help remember those things with them as time goes on. The other thing, if you are somebody grieving, it's okay to tell your friends. And if you can't bear to tell them that day, it's okay to tell your friends, hey, next week is our anniversary. I'm going to need some support that day. Ask for like tangible, concrete support and give tangible, concrete support. And then the other thing is just being able to, again, be a witness to it. So there's not a lot required of you. You don't have to have the right things to say.
Well, that's it, right? So many people get uncomfortable being around somebody who's crying because that's something that needs to be fixed, right? We have to calm them down
Right.
and get them laughing and giggling
Right.
immediately. And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that. But the beautiful thing is you don't have to do that.
Right. Your job is
You're
not
doing
to
enough
stop
just by
the grief.
being there with them while
Yes.
they're emotional. Just literally being in the same room with them is you're fulfilling your job obligation as a friend.
Exactly. Keeping in mind that like if they have 1,000 tears to cry, you're not going to stop them short of that, and that's okay. And it is not your job to stop it. It's not your job to make it softer for them. They're allowed, they are entitled to every bit of their grief. But yeah, you can be a witness to it. And when they want to talk about their loved one, you can be somebody who's willing to have that conversation.
Because we live in a world where, or I feel like we live in a world where the goal should be to calm you down. Mm-hmm. But that's a world that says these feelings of sorrow are inappropriate.
Right.
That you shouldn't be feeling this bad. And so now you've doubled up their sorrow because they are feeling horrible and they feel bad for feeling horrible.
Right. Right.
Like we've doubled down. Like you're wrong to feel this grief.
Yeah, and you've denied them a witness to their grief. Like, I mean, I hope that they have access to other people, and I get that we are not always going to be the ideal person to like be with somebody in their grief, but it's just sitting with them. It's just sitting there and letting those waves come and go, and letting those stages of grief go in and out of the conversation,
Right.
the moments where they're like laughing and remembering, and then that leads to some tears, and just getting to continue to be present for all of that, I think, is the biggest deal. But again, getting rid of all of these turns of phrase that we tend to use that say like, it's okay. Oh, they're in a better place now. Oh, you don't have to. They wouldn't want you to be sad.
Right. Right.
That anything where the end goal is like, stop it. Don't say that
If
thing.
I die, yeah, I want you torn up. I don't want you to be
Sad
like,
forever.
yes, she's gone.
Early grief 2 years, early grief 8 years.
8 years. I'll be up in wherever I'm at when I die. Like, yeah, she was in early grief for like a decade. Nux, nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Bro, that's sick.
That's sick. Nice.
Hmm.
Yeah. So an example of some complicated like grief in my life that I'm hoping allows some people to call the thing that they're dealing with grief.
You saw Rings of Power too.
I saw Rings of Power and it sucked. It was just so much potential. It was just miss.
There were so many things they got right in that show that it made the huge things they got wrong so infuriating.
So infuriating. An incredibly expensive swing and a miss.
Yeah. They got these great landscape vistas. The set design was incredible. I liked the costume design. The music was great.
Talented actors. With a horrible script.
Horrible script. If I could find those writers, I would be grieving. And I would want them to witness my grieving. Like,
Yeah.
no, you sit here and watch this. You watch what you've done.
Watch me be sad. Oh, okay, so that's
I waited 20 fucking years for this show, and you fucked it up. You
right.
fucked it up.
So it's good that you can now identify that as grief praise.
For a while, I was watching it. Was like, this is good. This is good. What I didn't realize is I was in denial.
I was going to say, were you in denial
I
then?
was drowning in denial.
You went through denial. I think then you went straight to bargaining. You were like, I don't know. Maybe they're going to pull it through. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
bad now, but maybe,
Yeah.
maybe they have a plan. And maybe if I just stick with it, there could be a plan here.
Yeah.
And there
Yeah.
wasn't.
Nope. Yeah, and then there was, now I'm just at acceptance. Like, it just fucking sucks. And
Yeah.
there's nothing I can do about that, you know?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
So that's one example. The other examples I'm thinking about right now, my grandfather is in the process of recovering from surgery. It was a very sudden like heart surgery that he needed. And I'm noticing a lot of grief coming up for me. He's alive. He made it. And he's most likely just going to recover and go back to living the life that he was living before.
It is not a coincidence that we're recording our grief episode while this is kind of ongoing. I at least I noticed that. We haven't talked about it explicitly.
Right. No. It's why I definitely want to talk about it, but it's funny because I've been thinking about grief, talking about grief for months. It's been on my mind.
Yeah.
And
But there's
now
a
this
reason
has
we're
happened very
recording it
suddenly.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's fine. So what's there to grieve? I'm noticing a lot of grief for all the time that I've lost with him. He moved when I was a teenager, and it was a very like sudden move, and I don't get to get down there as often as I want. And not only am I having some of the feelings you want to feel, you know, the like I'm going to get down there more often, and but I'm grieving like, ooh, that's a lot of years that weren't what maybe I hoped they could have been.
Right.
And a lot of grief around just acknowledging that all of my grandparents are getting older. And like you said, you haven't had a lot of loss. The two of us haven't had a lot of death loss in our life. And like knowing that that's ahead, it's made me grieve just like the moments I still know I won't get to spend, because there's a good reason that I'm not able to go down and visit that area as often. And it makes me sad that like those reasons still exist, even though I'd like to go more. Other griefs that I've experienced, again, that grief around like feeling like I didn't get to have the childhood that maybe children should get to have. There were a lot of ways that my childhood was so happy and carefree, but a lot of ways I was very much an adult as a child, and that's sad.
Yeah.
I should have gotten to be a kid.
Yeah.
I should have gotten to have more of a kid's mindset,
Yeah.
not just like experiences. Grief around, I will say I've moved through the grief around the time I spent in the relationships that I wish I didn't. I don't, but I have felt previously a lot of sadness around time spent in relationships that was like just time feeling bad for a long time, and like how sad that I spent those ages just like stuck in those places. Sadness around wishing like parents could be different than they are. Are things coming to mind for you? For you too? I have grief around pets is very real grief. And here's a way that like that button gets pushed occasionally, right? I had a dog who died, a family dog who died when I was a kid or when I was a teenager, and that was a sad hard day. But then the first time I took our current dog, Connie, to the vet when she was a puppy, I realized it was my first time going to a vet with a dog since my childhood dog had died. And the grief button got pushed. I'm sitting there with my brand new cute little puppy ready to like go get her first checkup with the vet, and I was like very teary-eyed
Right.
at the vet because it was that same wave of grief all over again.
I think about, the things that you're describing are just life.
Yeah.
I don't feel, and I think you would agree with this. I don't feel particularly emburdened with emburdened. I just don't feel particularly burdened with the woes of my life as compared to other people. I think that everybody. What's the sly look that you're giving me right
Well,
now?
that's something that we do all of the time. We're like, well, other people really had a lot to grieve. And that keeps us from grieving our stuff.
No, that's fair. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
No, that's a very good point. What I'm saying is that I do have griefs or sorrows in my life, as does everyone. The difference is that I have the opportunity to talk through those things.
Yeah.
Even on this podcast, I've shared a lot of those things. And
Yeah.
in therapy, I've shared a lot of those things. But with my friends and family,
Yeah.
I've been able to share and talk through these things.
Yeah.
And the difference is that I'm getting to deal with this
Yes.
stuff. I'm not talking about it because I feel like I had it worse off than anyone
Right.
else. I'm talking about it because that's how you work through it and find some peace and happiness on the other side.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect. That's exactly it. I think the things that I'm mentioning, a lot of them are slight griefs compared to somebody else's sorrow. They're like,
I met somebody in high school who had been adopted from Africa, and his entire family, actually village, had been
been wiped.
slaughtered in front of him when he was a young child.
yeah.
And I'm like, my dog died. It was really hard.
It was really hard. Yeah.
It's hard to compare yourself to somebody who's experienced something like that, but it doesn't change the fact that for real it was kind of hard when my dog died.
Yeah.
Well,
that's exactly it. Like there are some grief that's really really powerful. And I think something that's really important about that sort of grief is like who is witnessing that for that person? Who is really able to get in there and help like be a witness to trying to comprehend that level of loss.
Yeah.
And I think those people have so much less access to somebody who can really witness that, who can really like help bear that with them. But yeah, I think you and I have talked about so many things that we've grieved on this podcast, and I feel better afterwards. Like we get the space to talk about it, and
we lure in unsuspecting listeners and then trauma dump on them.
Yeah.
Yes!
Welcome. But that's the power of it. I think that I feel like I came into that episode about like the bad therapy thing feeling very heavy with that and just like ashamed of the way that I dealt with it.
Sharing your experience with a bad therapist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like ashamed that I had been through that experience, and I felt sad that I had been put, like I felt all this stuff, and I sound angry in that episode listening back.
That sound.
But because I was very angry in that episode. And then I haven't felt about it the same way since then, because I really got to tell you about it, and you asked good questions, and you were a witness to that grief.
Yeah.
And that really helped move through it. And that's mostly what we need, is somebody to be there and to ask good questions and to remember with us and to help us move through. Be like, okay, this bit of me has been seen. And I think that that really moves us through more than almost anything else. Again, it demands a witness.
Well, as we wrap up today, what are your anything else on the top of your mind that you'd want to share on this topic?
It's really, really important that despite what other people have been through, that you're able to look at the parts of your life where you still have some grief stuck, and that you feel allowed to call it grief and to grieve those things. Grief demands a witness. Grief usually demands, grief can usually be helped by some sort of ceremony. That's the way that we like burn stuff after a relationship, or we get, our dog's collar framed, or we do whatever. Like that stuff can feel silly to do.
Yeah.
Or dramatic to do. But honestly, like ceremony is important in the way that we acknowledge grief. So that stuff can be helpful. If you need to do something like that, do that. Know that your grief is allowed to also like be funny too. There's a lot of parts of grief that are weird and funny and strange. Again, with my friend who was grieving the loss of her parent, we were watching a show called Dead to Me, and she was like, it's one of the first shows I've ever seen get grief, because it's also hysterical and like weird and uncomfortable. And she's like, and there are so many parts of grief that just like, also I need a good laugh. Like I need a good cry,
Right.
and I also need a good laugh. And those things probably need to happen back and forth. And if
At
you're
funerals, like there's a lot of people eager to share a funny story.
Yeah.
And
yes.
we all laugh
Yep.
very quickly, and then we'll start crying very
Yep.
quickly in a funeral setting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because those are emotions, those physical reactions are quite similar.
Yes. Yeah, it does a very similar thing. It shakes your body,
Yeah.
and it provides a physical release. Like those things are all good to do. So just know that you don't have to set a timeline for your grief. Sorry for the dog. You don't have to set a timeline for your grief. You don't have to try to condense your grief down into something that's more acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to compare it to other people's grief. And also, like, you can let it be weird. You can let it be the things that it needs to be that would feel good for you.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think this was a nice chat, a nice conversation.
Chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time today, Ash.
Price, thank you for your time.
And we'll see you next time on I Married Your Therapist. I love a one-take Andy sort of conversation.
Thank goodness. I love a one-take episode.
A one and done.
Mm-hmm. That's the best.
Remember when that dude was like, how long does it take you to edit the episodes? And I was like, not very long. Like, we just
we just do it.
I've listened to podcasts or become familiar with podcasts where they like edit every sentence. Couldn't be me. Not us.
Who has the time?
Who has the time?
I have to like cry about stuff.
I hit record and hope for the best.
Fingers crossed.